Okay, so our final segment is the impact of neuroscience and specifically cognitive neuroscience on folk psychology. So what is neuroscience telling us now about folk psychology? And that, of course, means what is it telling us about who we are and how we explain our actions? So within cognitive neuroscience, there's an effort to develop what's called a cognitive ontology, which is a framework, a searchable computational database of psychological states based on evidence from neuroscience and scientific psychology, and also using informatics techniques to develop this, right? And the goal here is to develop a particular equivalent for psychology of the gene ontology used in biology. The gene ontology is a general framework for thinking about the relations between the various concepts used throughout biology, DNA, gene, etc., right? And far more fine-grained concepts. So the idea here is, can we develop a framework of psychological states, right, based on what we're finding in cognitive neuroscience, in scientific psychology, cognitive psychology, computational neuroscience, and so forth. And these are a few of the main players in this area, I think. So what I'm talking about will be derived from their work and that of others. So Kathy Price and Carl Friston, Russell Poldrak, and Michael Anderson have all contributed importantly to these efforts, which are ongoing. Okay, so that's a cognitive ontology, right? And the question is, what is folk psychology, right, in relation to this cognitive ontology? So the first question, right, of any effort to get a cognitive ontology is, what are the psychological parts, right? What are the components that we should look for in the brain, right? What are the parts of the mind? And this can sometimes be called the problem of isolating the cognitive functions. So for example, to give a simple example, recognizing faces, right? Most of us can do this. We have the ability to do it. People with prosopagnosia can't do it, right? So we know there's a very clear ability to recognize faces that some people do not have. So, again, basic options here, which have nuances and variants. So the basic option is, well, we have a dedicated or specific face recognition ability, right? And this face recognition ability kicks in when we get face-based information, right? So when you're looking at somebody's face, this face recognition ability will kick in, right? The second option is, no, we don't have a specific face recognition ability. We have a general recognition ability, and then that ability will output face percepts when it's given face-based information. So you have one ability for recognizing cars and another, and you have an ability to recognize cars and faces and cats and trees and so forth. And these are all ways of visually recognizing, right? And the only difference is that you have this one mechanism, and you feed particular kinds of information into it, which will feed out particular kinds of percepts, right? But there's no one specific face-based or facial recognition ability. So those are two basic options about the psychological parts. The second question is the neural parts, right? So corresponding with the psychological function or cognitive function, you have the neural structures, right? And so here the question is, what are the corresponding brain areas or processes or networks, right, that we should locate these psychological components in? And this is sometimes called establishing specificity of structure, right? So again, for example, what is the area for, in quotes, face recognition, right? What network or area or processing does the face recognition, right? And this is a neural question, not a psychological question, at least not directly. So the first basic option is, well, there is a particular area, right? There is a dedicated area, which we have dubbed the fusiform face area, right? And the second option is no, there's a more general network of areas that will include the fusiform gyrus, but it's not dedicated to faces. And again, you see the same basic sorts of differences here between thinking that there is a dedicated mechanism versus a mechanism that is general and just outputs particular types of, percepts or whatever, depending on the information that's fed into it, right? And this can be located, in a number of different places. Okay, so the problem, right, of cognitive ontology is how do you get these two things together, right? So first of all, Nancy Canwisher and some of her colleagues and others as well located the area of the fusiform gyrus, which I had in the previous slide, that appears to preferentially process face information, right? And correspondingly, this area got dubbed the fusiform face area, or FFA. So it looks like we have a very specific ability, facial recognition, that is realized in a very specific brain area, the fusiform face area, right? That's a nice, clean, one-to-one correspondence. But then we found that, well, actually, the fusiform face area also is more preferentially active when you're scanning experts about cars, or you're experts about birds, or other things that you are an expert about. So this yields a real problem, and this is the problem that cognitive neuroscience is trying to figure out right now, right? What's going wrong, right? So again, you could think, well, we've got the wrong psychological part here, right? Maybe we shouldn't be looking for specifically face ability. Maybe that's not what we should be mapping. Or maybe we're looking for it at the wrong place. Maybe it's not that particular place in the fusiform gyrus. Maybe there's just a different place that is being processed at. So it's a problem. It looks like we had a nice, neat one-to-one correspondence between what is essentially a folk psychological concept, face recognition, right, with a brain area, with the fusiform gyrus or part of the fusiform gyrus, right? And that would look like a really nice, neat vindication of realism, right? But that's not what seems to be happening, and that's the problem, right? So what we're trying to do is, of course, solve this problem. And again, your two basic options are, well, the findings in the brain should overrule the functional framework, right? So in other words, we give up the psychological parts that we're getting from folk psychology, and we think of other concepts. For example, you might say, well, we don't have a face recognition ability, we just have a visual expertise ability, or something like that, right? To be filled in, right? But in any case, we are sliding away from our folk psychological way of thinking about our mental states. The second basic option is to let the functional framework trump or overrule the structural findings. So we keep our face recognition ability, right? And instead, we just kind of give up the idea that we're going to be able to locate these things in particular brain areas or particular networks or anything like that, right? So, we're not quite sure which of these two should go. And often, a neuroscientist will go more for option one, psychologists will go more towards option two, but they're all under discussion, debate, experimental investigation, and so forth. Okay, so how does this intersect with folk psychology? Well, we start looking at the brain using our folk psychological components, right? Or some slight modification. So I mentioned face recognition. There's also memory. Memory is a concept from folk psychology, but there's been a lot of work on memory dividing, at the very least, one distinction is between short-term or working memory and then long-term memory, right? Now, folk psychology did not originally have this distinction. Now it may have been assimilated into folk psychology, but in any case, that's a revision of the way we used to think about memory, right? It used to be simpler, just memory, and now it's more complicated. Okay, so we start with folk psychology, and what we find is that these components, the folk psychological components, aren't being mapped very readily to brain areas. Right. In some case, the same networks will be involved in abilities that folk psychology distinguishes, and in other cases, different networks are involved in abilities that folk psychology will count as the same. So there's a mismatch, right? There's a mismatch between the components that we inherit from folk psychology and what we're finding in the brain. So, is folk psychology a bust, right? That's what the eliminativist would say. Is it a good approximation, right? Even if it's not perfect, is it pretty close? That's something that the realist might say, right? Or should we be looking in the head at all for these mental states, right? Maybe we're just looking in the wrong place to begin with, which is what a quasi-realist might say. So, where are we going at this point, right? Well, there's two things I think that appear from a number of different sources to be sort of fixed points as we go forward, right? One is we will continue to hold each other responsible for our actions, right? That does not seem to be something that's negotiable. A lot of people in the free will debate have found that, people will always tend to hold people responsible, right, as the sort of the primary thing that they think is correct, right? So that's very unlikely to be something that we will give up. The second thing is we will also, I think, continue to think of ourselves in psychological terms, right? Whether that gets revised or not is a different story, but the idea is that we think of ourselves in terms of our preferences, our character. We don't have direct access, it seems, to what our brain is doing, but we do have direct, or at least non-inferential, some sort of direct access to what's going on in our minds, right? Our minds are accessible to us in ways that our brains are not. And so that we think of ourselves in the mental terms that we have access to is pretty clear. Okay, but these two fixed points are consistent with a number of different options, right? And these roughly map onto the options that we saw with folk psychology, right? One is revision in some way, right? So we revise our folk psychological parts, components, folk psychology in, relatively minor ways. We somehow assimilate the neural and scientific psychological information that we gain into our psychological self-conceptions, right? So for example, the memory work that has modified the way we think about memory would be a case of that, right? There could be replacement, right? Where we'll basically just replace it with a new neurocognitive framework where there's some vestiges of folk psychology, but essentially it's substantially different, right? And this doesn't exist yet, so I can't really give you a clear example. But the idea is that what we think of now, the way we think of ourselves now in terms of the self, why we do what we do, all that kind of stuff will be replaced in some fairly radical manner. But there will still be bits and pieces of folk psychology left, right, in some form. And then the third option is just complete abandonment, right? So we'll just check it all out, right? And we'll just end up with something entirely brain-based, right? We're not even going to bother with a psychological framework, except, maybe as a useful fiction, right? And an analogy here might be something like the way we still talk about the sun rising, right? We talk about the sun rises, the sun sets, right? Now we know from astronomy that the sun doesn't actually move at all, at least from our perspective. It's the Earth that moves around the sun, okay? But we still talk as if the sun moves around the Earth, right? It rises and it sets. But we know that that's not true, right? We still talk that way, but it's not true. And so the abandonment option is kind of that. Yeah, maybe we will, have lingering uses of folk psychological terms, but we know they're false, okay? Now, as you can see, these are, basic options. There can be lots of nuances and mixing and a continuum of various views. But you can see that they kind of map onto somewhat the three options of folk psychology that we started with, right? So the revision one would be more or less a realist kind of view, right? We're basically got important stuff right, even if we have to revise it. The second way would be more of, it might be an eliminativist view. It could be a quasi-realist view, right? And the abandonment one, of course, seems pretty clearly to be an eliminativist view. It doesn't have to be, but that seems to be the most clear option there. So all of this is open-ended. None of this has been decided. We are looking very hard for the right sort of way of dividing up our psychological states, for understanding what they are, and even for thinking about, should we even be talking in terms of psychology or not, right? And all of this obviously has a relationship to what we do when we're looking at the brain. Is it just a meat, a bunch of meat that fires in various ways, right, and has nothing to do with any sort of psychological constructs, right? Or is there some sort of way of thinking about mentality, of thinking about psychology that makes sense to look at the brain? And of course, what will that do to our common sense view of how we think about ourselves and how we think about our actions and our responsibility for action, right? That's where folk psychology gets connected to neuroscience.